Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for May 5th. And as you can see in the notes below, our paper number 2 is going to be due on the 12th, which is this upcoming Monday. So I will honestly take the paper up until the final examination. Our final examination is due, or will be posted, I should say, on Wednesday the 14th. But that would be the very last day that you could hand in that paper or any revisions. As you know, paper number 1 has the option of being revised. You all should have received paper number 1 back from me. Not necessarily revisions, but at least the first paper itself. So if you haven't at this point, please contact me. And while you all have the option of a revision, you're not required to revise. But if you so wanted to, what I ask is that you take my comments into account, and not just the grammar suggestions, but also, more importantly, the comments at the ending of the paper. And that you write a revision and that you submit in the original with my comments on it along with your revision. And so I can compare and contrast and then evaluate and get you the higher of the two grades. So I see the first paper as a kind of learning exercise. And even if you don't decide to write paper number 1, please read the comments carefully because you can apply them to paper number 2, which is going to be very similar to what you did with paper number 1. The distinction being that this time you are writing about drama rather than writing about short story. And you have the option of either writing about performance or you have the option of writing about text. And while they both have similarities, they will also have difference. So if you're writing about the films, you're talking about some of the elements of film, such as lighting and cinematography and so forth, acting. And if you are writing about text, then you're just concentrating on the actual language itself and not necessarily thinking about the production. And some productions are more similar to the text, something like A Raisin in the Sun, which made sense because Lorraine Hansberry herself worked on the screenplay. Others are much more different, so it just depends on adaptation. So we saw definitely an adaptation when we were talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream, for instance. And again, the length is about the same, 4 to 5 pages. The focus is about the same, a critical paper, so you shouldn't be relying on outside resources. The topics are pretty much the same, so you're either writing about contemporary relevance or you are talking about canon, or you're creating your own topic, but you're getting it approved by me ahead of time. And this is actually going to be our attendance question for today. Do you have any questions about paper number 2? And if you don't, you can just say you don't have any questions, and then you've satisfied the requirement for that discussion forum response. But if you do have questions, certainly this is your time for expressing them. And as we are in the midst of poetry, we won't have time for a paper for poetry, but our final exam will be devoted 80 points mostly to poetry. So the final will be posted on Wednesday the 14th. And what I will do is I will post it at the time in which we would normally meet, which is 10:30 a.m. if we were in a face-to-face class. And you would have 24 hours in which to complete that final and return it to me. So that would mean that you would return it on Tuesday by 5:15 at 10:30 a.m. And I don't expect you to spend 24 hours on that final. I expect you to spend approximately 2 hours, which is what you would be spending in a face to face situation. So, obviously, in 2 hours, you're not going to write something that is developed or as detailed as what you would write with a paper. I'm certainly not expecting that. But at the minimum, what you should be able to do is to write coherent sentences. You should be able to have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And students will oftentimes ask me during the final, how long should the final be? And basically, it's as long as you can make it in the time period that you have. You're supposed to show off what you can do, but again, you're not expected to write a paper, something that is as developed or as detailed. And again, you're expected to spend approximately 2 hours on it, not 24 hours. So That would be the very last day that I would accept any assignments, would be Wednesday the 14th at 10:30. Though ideally you would have paper number 2 due or submitted by the 12th, which is the Monday, so that you could go into the final without having to be concerned about your paper because you would have already completed that assignment. 80 points are devoted to poetry. It'll be essay questions from which you can choose. And it's open book, open notes, so I'm not expecting you to memorize anything. The idea is that you can synthesize major points and ideas that we've been talking about in the semester. The best way to prepare for the final exam is to have read all of the poetry, as well as to have seen all of the class discussions about poetry. As you know, I retire each week and put it in the class discussion form folder, so you can access the entire semester if you so wanted to. And also to read your classmates' discussion form responses and my responses in turn. So, that said, we are in the midst of poetry, and we began by talking about Dead Poets Society, which will be an option because, as you know, film is just as important as text in this particular class. But if you didn't want to write about Dead Poets Society, and again, you won't know what the questions are until you actually see the final examination. So, again, the best way to prepare is to have read everything. After you're done writing about poetry, what you will see is that you've got 10 points on the final that will be devoted to short story, 10 points on the final that will be devoted to drama. Again, you don't know what the questions are, but your responses should be shorter than what you would do for poetry because obviously these questions are worth less. And the best way, again, to prepare is just to have done all of the reading, so that when you see the questions, you can make some educated decisions about how you want to go about responding. And again, you can use things like our class notes. You can use things like class videos. It is open book, open notes. The class discussion forum responses and my responses in turn. As you can see, I've been catching up with all of that. So I've responded to all of the discussion forums about drama. And soon I will be getting to all of the discussion forums about poetry. And certainly you can utilize all of that information as well. And then we began talking about some poems and different kinds of styles of writing. And we spent a good amount of time with a biography of Emily Dickinson, Miss Emily, as she's known as locally, because she is from Amherst, Massachusetts. So spending a little bit of extra time on her seemed to make sense. And one of the things about Emily Dickinson is that she oftentimes writes about death, but not necessarily as a negative, as a positive. So the poem that we're doing today about Emily Dickinson is a good example of that. And she also speaks from the perspective of the dead. And today's poem is also a good example of that. And while she oftentimes writes poetry that's very personal, she uses the I. It also is universal. And I think that's one of the ways that Emily Dickinson is so powerful as an author. As we saw with the documentary, is that she oftentimes expresses universal themes in a way that very few have been able to do. So she's really able to use language to express emotion, which is no easy thing to do. And one of the things that hopefully you learned by seeing the documentary is that there are two versions of Emily Dickinson's poetry. That when her poetry was first published, and this is just horrific from a poetic standpoint, editors changed her poetry. They, quote, corrected, unquote, some of the elements of the poetry so that it would follow the conventions of grammar or mechanics. You never do that to a poet. And then, of course, her poetry appeared in its original form in the 1950s, and it was a completely different kind of poetry. And it's fairly easy to tell if you're reading Emily Dickinson's correct poetry because you need to look for the dash at the ending of lines. If you see the dashes at the ending of lines, that's what Emily Dickinson wrote. She used dashes, which are long pauses, as opposed to commas, which is what the corrected, if you will, Emily Dickinson poets poetry does, and the comma is the conventional way to show a dash. It makes sense that she would break convention even with her grammatical structures, even with her punctuation, by using dashes, because she broke convention in so many ways, in the way she lived her life and in the way that she wrote. It also, I think, illustrates the idea that poetry is a much more open ended form than perhaps anything else in literary genre. And yes, you can be experimental with short story and with drama and with novel, but particularly with poetry. And you can do that and break all kinds of grammatical conventions. And we see that also with her irregular capitalization. And sometimes that capitalization is quite important in terms of some of the thematic elements that are going on within her poetry. And you can visit the Emily Dickinson Museum. I highly encourage you to. I believe there are actually discounts as well for college students. And in the notes below, I've given a link where you can look at her you can look at the Emily Dickinson Museum. And the poem that I chose is a poem that is probably one of her better known poems because it's understandable. And as we saw with the documentary, even the scholars themselves struggle with understanding Emily Dickinson. I must say that as an undergraduate, I didn't much care for Emily Dickinson because I wasn't really comfortable with understanding what it was she was saying. I was struggling with it. And then when I learned that the scholars and critics also struggle with her writing, I felt much better about it. And I've learned that with Emily Dickinson, sometimes it's best not to try to understand every single word in a poem, but just to perhaps find a line or two that speaks to you. And this poem is written, if you see CA next to it, that means circa, that means around the time of 1863. Remember that she did not publish in her lifetime, so these poems were published after she was gone, and they were not dated, though individuals have, scholars and so forth, have tried to organize them into a numerical form. So we refer to her poetry by its first line because she didn't title any of her poems. And this poem reads, because I, notice the personal I here, could not stop for death. Notice the capitalization of D for death, which personifies death. He kindly stopped for me. And there's a long literary tradition of referring to death as male. Think about the Grim Reaper. The idea is that we don't get to determine when we die. Death determines when we die, which is why we don't stop for death. Death stops for us. And notice how death is referred to as kind, which is really unusual. And when you think about the way most people think of death and portray death. But in her mind, death is kind because it offers something, immortality. And while we learned in the documentary that Emily Dickinson wasn't specifically religious, she was very spiritual. So the proof of God was not by going to church, it was through seeing nature or perhaps poetry like this. When she says that death came for her and they went in death's carriage, which held but just ourselves in immortality. So what death brings is immortality. Long literary tradition that life is a journey and you are riding in a carriage. And of course, at the time, it would have been a horse-drawn carriage that they would have been riding in 1863. And then our next stanza, and as you know, stanzas are breaks in poetry, much like paragraphs are breaks in prose. So we've got a new idea. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So we're talking about death, and death is driving slowly and doesn't have any haste because there is no such thing as time in eternity. It's limitless. So you don't have to worry about things like rushing or being late. And you don't have to worry about labor, work, and you also don't have to worry about leisure. And leisure is existing in our earthly realm because of labor. But if labor doesn't exist, then we don't need leisure either. The afterlife is a completely different concept of the world. We pass the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We pass the fields of grazing grain. We pass the setting sun. And this stanza talks about the stages of life symbolically. The school is supposed to represent, and children is supposed to represent youth. At recess, they're playing. In the ring, if you've ever heard of the child's game Ring Around the Rosie, a pocket full of posy, which ironically happens to be about death and plague. We pass the fields of gazing grain. This represents adulthood, farming, being with the gazing grain in the field. We pass the setting sun. Setting sun is supposed to represent the ending of life. Or rather, he passed us. In other words, that they are moving from the earthly realm to the spiritual realm. The Jews drew quivering and chill. So now we see transition here. The weather is changing. It's getting colder. For only gossamer my gown and my tippet, which is defined in the textbook, which means a shawl. Only tulle. So tulle is a very thin fabric. They make things like tutus and wedding veils out of it. Gossamer is also a very thin, insubstantial fabric. It's oftentimes associated with the fairy world. So the idea here is that you don't need clothing as you're transitioning into the afterworld. Even though it's getting cold, we use clothing in our world, the human realm, either because of convention or for protection, again, against the elements. You don't need to worry about that in the afterlife, the elements, which is where they're headed. We paused before a house that seemed the swelling of the ground. Notice the capitalization of house. So we can speculate as to what house this is. Perhaps it's the house of God, or perhaps it's the tomb or the crypt. Perhaps it's even the house of the deceased, because there is a tradition of taking the casket by the home of the deceased. But this is so far away, this house, that it seemed like a swelling of the ground. The roof itself was scarcely visible, it was so far away. The cornice, which is an architectural element of the roof, was in the ground. So it just appears like a little dot. This is how far away they've gotten from the earthly realm. And then the most important stanza, perhaps the last stanza, which gives us a sense of time. Since then, 'tis centuries. This happened centuries ago, and yet feels shorter than the day. And again, in the afterlife, you don't have time. I first surmised the horses' heads, so these would be the horses that would be pulling the carriage, were toward eternity. And of course, the carriage is bringing her to eternity, but this is also a biblical reference if you know the four horsemen of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation. So this is something that also signifies the ending of life for everyone and everything. And the proof of an afterlife is in this poem, because she's speaking from the perspective of the dead. She's already dead and she's already in the afterlife, which is all of the proof that we need is in this poem. We don't need to go to the pulpit, let's say, and to hear a spiritual representative try to convince us that the afterlife exists. Very typical of Emily Dickinson. And the last poem that I wanted to talk about today is The Road Not Taken. And not only is it an incredibly famous poem, but it is perhaps the second most misunderstood poem on the face of the planet. The first being the Shakespearean sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, which we had talked about, that many times that poem is read as a love poem written to a woman. But there's no reference anywhere in the poem as to the gender of the individual the poem is written to. And it's less about love, and it's more, or romantic love, and more about flattery, especially if we consider that these are the early sets of poems that are thought to have been written to Shakespeare's patron, probably the Earl of Southampton. Makes a lot of political sense to flatter one's patron, because they provide economic and political support. Well, The Road Not Taken is also misunderstood. And you can see that in the notes below, what I've done is I have included where you can find this poetry, and also where you could watch on YouTube and have Hemingway himself read his own poems. Now we've moved to the point where you can actually listen to Hemingway read his poem, and I encourage you to do so. And the reason why this poem is so often misunderstood is because people don't take account the title. And if you'll remember, we've been talking about this all semester long, the importance of the title. And the title is The Road Not Taken. The title is not The Road Taken, it's The Road Not Taken. And if the road represents a choice, then this is about the choice that's not made. And we're told that two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. So these roads are supposed to represent choices. And the idea is being in the woods is oftentimes a time of experiencing wilderness that's wild and untamed, of self discovery, if you will. We saw that with young Goodman Brown, for instance. And if these two roads are diverging, the fork in the road, so to speak, you need to make a choice because you can't travel both at the same time. And this individual is looking at both roads and trying to make a determination as to which is the better road, or in other words, which is the better choice. And yellow wood, I can't help but think, but Frost was a New Englander, and if you know anything about autumns in New England, you know about the bright colors, including the yellow leaves. And autumn is a time of transition as well, as is the subject matter of this poem. When one needs to make a choice, transition occurs. So the next stanza reads, The other then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. Again, we have another example of fair, not necessarily representing justice, but being as beautiful. Or in other words, as this person is contemplating these two roads or these two choices, they appear to be equal. Maybe one is better than another. Note the word perhaps, because perhaps it has been less chosen by others. But that morning, it seems like they're both equal. So at that particular moment, both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. So no road was particularly well traveled. Oh, how I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. The idea that you've got two choices here, and yes, you might hope that you can go back to your original two choices, but once you make a choice, it sets off a chain reaction, so you can probably not go back to the choice that you didn't make. And again, remember the title, The Road Not Taken. And then the last stanza. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a road, and I took the one less traveled by. That has made all the difference. So when someone sighs, they can sigh with pleasure, but they can also sigh with regret or longing. So I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. In the future, I'll be talking about this. Two roads diverge in a wood, and notice the repetition of I. This is an individual choice that we all have to make. I took the one less traveled by. That's made all the difference. We're never told if this is a positive difference. It's the way the poem usually is read. We just know it's a difference. And if we take into account the title, The Road Not Taken, this poem is more about the very human response of wondering what if. Regardless if we are content with the choice we've made or not, we will oftentimes contemplate what would have happened if we made a different choice. So this poem is explicated in our textbook. And if you remember, we talked about explicated, very detailed analysis, line by line, word by word, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation. And I wanted to read you the example that they give us of explication, understanding that I'm not expecting something nearly this detailed or developed on the final examination. This reads more like what you might write in a paper. If we had a couple more weeks to the semester, you could submit in a paper number 3 on poetry, but we don't. But this analysis has a nice introduction, multiple body paragraphs, and a concluding paragraph. And it begins that the road not taken intrigues readers because it is at once so simple and so deeply resonant. Recalling a walk in the woods, the speaker describes how he came to a fork in the road, which forced him to choose one path over another, though, quote, sorry, unquote, that, quote, he could not travel both, unquote. He made a choice after carefully weighing his two options. This essentially is what happens in the poem. There's no other action. However, the incident is charged with symbolic significance by the speaker's reflections on the necessities and consequences of his decision. So that's the first paragraph. It's a great first paragraph. Does a little bit of quotation, summarizes what the poem is about, and gives us our thesis about the necessity and consequences of decision making. Then the first body paragraph. The final stanza indicates that the choice concerns more than simply walking down a road. The speaker says that choosing the quote, less traveled, unquote, path has affected his entire life. And, quote, that has made all the difference, unquote. Frost draws on a familiar enough metaphor when he compares life to a journey, but he's also calling attention to a less commonly noted problem. Despite our expectations, aspirations, appetites, hopes, and desires, we can't have it all. Making one choice precludes another. It's impossible to determine what particular decision the speaker refers to. Perhaps he had to choose a college, a career, or spouse. There's no way to know because Frost wisely creates a symbolic choice, implicitly invites us to supply our own circumstances. And I'll stop after this first body paragraph. Note that the writer went out of chronological order. You don't have to begin talking about a poem by talking about its first line or first stanza. You can talk about the ending, which is what they do, and the idea that one choice precludes another. And the next body paragraph reads, the speaker's reflections about his choice are essential to an understanding of the poem as a choice itself. Indeed, they may be more central. He describes the road taken as, quote, having perhaps the better claim, unquote. Quote, having perhaps the better claim, / because it was grassy and wanted wear, unquote. He prefers a less traveled path. This seems to be an expression of individualism, which would account for, quote, the difference, unquote, his choice made in his life. But Frost complicates matters by having the speaker also acknowledge that there was no significant difference between the two roads. One was, quote, just as fair, unquote, as the other. Each, quote, was worn really about the same, unquote. And, quote, both that morning equally lay, / and leaves no step had trodden black. Note that in some of these quotes that I'm quoting, there is a /, which I've been reading out loud. That / indicates a break in the line of poetry. So what you're doing is quoting 2 lines of poetry, but as you know, poetry does not go to the ending of the line. It's got a staggered line. So the / would indicate where one line ends and then another line begins. And it talks about the idea of perhaps having the better claim. And that this seems to be an expression. So the qualification is not directly stated. This is exactly what's happening. This is what could be happening. And then in the next body paragraph, the speaker imagines that in the future, quote, ages and ages hence, quote, he will recount his choice with a, quote, sigh, unquote, that will satisfactorily explain the course of his life. But Frost seems to be having a little fun here by showing us how the speaker will embellish his past decision to make it appear more dramatic. What we hear is someone trying to convince himself that the choice he made significantly changed his life. When he recalls what happened in the, quote, yellow wood, unquote, a color that gives a glow into the irretrievable moment when his life seemed to be on the verge of a momentous change, he appears more concerned with the path he did not choose than with the one he did. Frost shrewdly titles the poem to suggest the speaker's sense of loss at not being able to, quote, travel both, unquote, roads. When the speaker's reflections about his choice are examined, the poem reveals his nostalgia instead of affirming his decision to travel a self-reliant path in life. Note that in that particular body paragraph, it gives a possible explanation for yellow wood. I had suggested that perhaps it represents autumn and transition. Here, this author says it's a color that gives glow to that irretrievable moment when life seemed to be on the verge of momentous change, which is somewhat similar, but not exactly as to what I said. Now, the second to the last paragraph reads, the rhyme stanzas of the road now taken follow a pattern established in the first 5 lines, A, B, A, A, B. This rhyme scheme reflects, perhaps, the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. The natural speech rhythms Frost uses allow him to integrate the rhymes unobtrusively, but there's a slight shift in lines 19 and 20. When the speaker asserts self-consciously that, quote, the less traveled, unquote, road, which we already know to be basically the same as the other road, quote, made all the difference, unquote. Unlike all the other rhymes in the poem, difference does not rhyme precisely with hence. The emphasis must be placed on difference to make it rhyme precisely with hence, which may suggest the speaker is trying a little too hard to pattern his life on his earlier choice in the woods. Remember, we had talked about the idea of scanning a poem, looking at its construction, seeing if it's got a meter, a beat, or if it's got a rhyme scheme or a rhyme pattern. And this author talked about the rhyme scheme, which is A, B, A, A, B. But if you aren't going to scan a poem and talk about its construction, then you need to talk about how those elements are important to the theme of the poem, which this author does. Now, whether or not this is the correct answer, that I don't know, but it certainly is a possible answer. And that's really the level that you're held to, so that it's probable. And not even probable, just possible. So it could be that the rhyme scheme, and notice how they qualify their argument, perhaps reflects the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. And then we have our concluding paragraph, which is supposed to tie up loose ends. Perhaps the best way to begin reading Frost's poetry is to accept the invitation he placed at the beginning of many volumes of his poems. The pasture means what it says, of course. It is about taking care of some farm chores, but it's also a means of saying one thing in terms of another. So a very good conclusion that ties up loose ends. Could be a little bit longer. The writer here used a semicolon so that we've technically got 2 sentences and a paragraph should be 3. But that's a minor quibble, particularly if you were going to write for a final examination and not a paper. Certainly you're not going to be held to those standards. But I wanted to be able to not only talk about The Road Not Taken, because it's such a famous poem, and it's so oftentimes misread, but we get a wonderful example of an explication as well. So in our next class, we are going to talk about the poem America by Allen Ginsberg. We're going to talk about the Beat Poets, which is a style of writing by Allen Ginsberg, and also a poem by Martina Spada called Coca-Cola and Coco Frio. You can see that I've included the notes in the notes below under the 3rd section, the links for that if you don't have access to the textbook. So again, the attendance question, which is due on Wednesday the 7th, but certainly if you need additional time, just ask me for an extension. Do you have any questions about paper number 2? And if so, what are those questions? And if you don't have any questions, you can just say no. So I hope you're doing well. And again, you should have received paper number 1 back from me, unless you've submitted in a revision. I'm still working on revisions. So if you've submitted in paper number 1 and not received it, please let me know. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.